The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this is Jennifer Schaus, and welcome to our government contracting webinar series. Today we're going to be covering contract negotiations with Christoph Minarczyk. So thanks everybody who has joined us today. This is a recorded webinar, as all of our webinars are. So in the event that you miss any of our webinars, you can find them on our website under the webinar section. The full schedule is there along with all of the recordings, which we usually post by close of business the same day. Tomorrow, which is Friday, we are covering FAR flow down clauses and responsibilities for primes and subcontractors. Next week, we will get into indirect rates, cost proposals, section L and M of the proposal, maximizing profitability in firm fixed price contracts, and Friday of next week, we cover GSA schedule. A little bit about us, based in downtown Washington, D.C., provide various services for government contractors, anything from market analysis reports, capability statements, 8A certification, GSA schedules, and additional services listed there on the slide. We host various networking events and seminars throughout the year. You can find those on our website under the events section, or an easier way is to sign up for our newsletter under the Contact Us section. A little bit about me is on this slide, but more importantly, I'd rather talk about Christoph, and we'll dig into his presentation about contract negotiations. Thanks, Christoph, for joining us today. I'm excited to hear what you've got to say. I'm going to move to the slide that has a little bit background about yourself, and we'll start. So the floor is all yours. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. So howdy, everybody out there. I'm Christoph Minarczyk. I'm the owner of ChristophLLC.com, and through that company, I'm a professor, author, consultant, and an expert witness in federal litigation concerning government contracts. And then I also serve as a director of policy at a defense contractor, and one of their clients is the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Office of Small Business Programs, where I'm the senior policy advisor. So I barely get any sleep. But if we move on to the next slide, again, ChristophLLC.com offers professional instruction and training on site, as well as consulting and expert witness services. But what you're here for today is to learn about getting your way in government contracts, the 4 sources of authority in government contracts. Now, whenever I teach a course, this is one of these fundamental pillars for your knowledge in government contracts. And I tell my students, if you don't absorb this information, I will find you, I will catch you, and I will take your teaching certificate and your course completion stuff back, because this is vitally important to any other lesson that you learn in government contracts. So the first thing to get out of your mind is this thing called Fred said. And this is a very poisonous thing for you to follow in government contracts. We want to avoid this. So I have a picture here of my wonderful dog, Fred. And whatever Fred tells me, whatever Fred said, it's great, but I can't rely on that in government contracts. So an example of Fred said, something you shouldn't listen to. Oh, well, that's what they said to do. And if we go to the next slide, another example of what Fred said would be, well, that's how we always do it. And then the third example on the next slide would be something to the effect of, well, I've been in contracting for 50 years, and I've worked at the Air Force, the Pentagon, and in private industry. Well, we move to the next slide with Grumpy Cat, and I'll give you my opinion of what all those things really mean. They don't mean anything. So what I emphasize on the next slide is that we don't want to rely on anything Fred said. That's just personal authority, and there really is no personal authority. We are professionals. This is the contracting profession. So as a professional, we always provide citations, we provide authority, and we provide sources for anything that we share with our colleagues, and we base those on research. So let's dive into that on the next slide and figure out what we're really talking about. Well, the reason I tell you not to listen to what Fred said, my dog is wonderful, and maybe your boss is wonderful, and maybe that person that you met at the conference is wonderful, but do they have the authority of Congress, an executive agency, a federal policy official, or a judicial forum? If the answer is no, then you shouldn't really consider what Fred said as actual authority. You should take it with a grain of salt and you should research it on your own, but you should look for one of these 4 sources of authority in government contracts. So if we move to this next graphic, this is my pyramid, my hierarchy of authority. Now, at the top, we have statutes. Below statutes, we have regulations. Below regulations, we have policy. Off to the side, we have court decisions because those really interpret all three of the other major sources of authority. And these are in order because a regulation can never trump a statute, and an agency policy can never trump a regulation. In fact, the way the Federal Acquisition Regulation is built, a lot of people don't realize that much of it is created by statutes from Congress. In other words, the FAR is often simply implementing this higher authority, these statutes and laws, which are passed by Congress. And what's the purpose of knowing all this? This is going to inform your decision-making process. This is also going to help you when you negotiate with your subcontractors or when you negotiate with your contracting officer and your federal government client. You'll be speaking their language. You'll be using relevant, legitimate authority that is persuasive and that will help you get your way in a contract negotiation. So let's move to the next slide and talk about statutes at the top of the pyramid. Of course, we all know these are laws passed by the legislative branch. That would be the Congress critters, right? Now, how do we know we're dealing with this source of authority? Well, you're going to see a couple numbers and then USC and then some more numbers. Now, that's not the University of South Carolina. No, that's United States Code. That's where all these public laws passed by Congress are eventually organized and put into a sensible fashion within the United States Code. But the citations you see, it might be 18 USC 101. That is immediately your sign that you're dealing with a statute. On the next slide, we have just a few examples of these important statutes and another hint for you. If you see something ends in the word act, ACT, you're probably dealing with something passed by Congress. So for government contracts, we really care about Competition and Contracting Act, or CICA. That defines and requires full and open competition in all government contracts unless we have an exception. So you see that implemented in, for instance, FAR Part 15. Then we have the Contract Disputes Act, which governs the way that you can submit a certified claim for monetary relief under your existing government contract. That would be implemented in FAR Part 33. Another example, the National Defense Authorization Act. We see that every year. It's a giant political football that everybody fights over, but we also see a lot of acquisition and contracting rules being changed and policies being implemented using the NDAA. So there's plenty more statutes, but we need to cover that in maybe a future presentation. So let's move to regulations. Now, once Congress passes a statute, it's up to the federal executive agencies to implement the nitty-gritty details of that statute. So Competition and Contracting Act might have this broad policy of full and open competition, but in FAR Part 15, we see the actual details of how contracting officers will implement that requirement. Now, I want to draw your attention to something. We have this CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. Now, that's analogous to the United States Code. The CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, that's where we're going to see the organized hierarchy of all these regulations, including the FAR. The FAR would be at Title 48, Chapter 1 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And if we move to the next slide, I really want you to remember this other regulation. It's not just about the FAR. There's another regulation in the Code of Federal Regulations that you should know about, and that's the series of SBA, Small Business Administration Regulations. This is where you find the nitty-gritty details about your women-owned small business, service-disabled veteran-owned small business, hub zone, all these very important programs that you participate in. You're going to find that in Title 13 of the Code of Federal Regulations. That's kind of SBA's playground for where they create their regulations. Moving to the next slide, I'm going to give you a mnemonic device, a tool to use when you're researching the FAR, because it can really be a lot to consider and handle. Whenever you read the FAR, unless you're me who absolutely loves reading the FAR, people get sad, right? SAD. And I encourage you to always use the SAD method of reading the scope, applicability, and definitions section. Anytime somebody throws a FAR reference your way, you need to review the scope, applicability, and definitions, because this is going to give you the full context. You cannot read any regulation or statute out of context and isolated. You must read it as a whole. And reading the scope will give you the overarching principle. The applicability will tell you whether this even applies to the facts of your situation. And the definitions will be very important, because there might be special definitions that only apply in the particular FAR provision, clause, or section that you're dealing with. So we've covered two sources of the four: statutes by Congress, regulations by agencies. Now we're going to turn to the third source, policy. Now on this slide, I'm calling policy the wild card, because this is the most difficult one to track and research. This is where you want to have a good relationship with your existing and prospective government clients, because sometimes this will be internal policy, internal directives and memos that you might not be able to find on a public website. So whenever the government provides you with some internal agency policy, you want to be real polite and inquisitive and see if you can get a copy of that, because you might not otherwise have access to it. But again, policy is a wild card, hard to track. It's not in an open forum necessarily, but it's one that will affect your relationship as a government contractor. Moving on to the fourth source of authority, that would be court decisions. Now I have this slide of Egyptian hieroglyphics up because, don't tell anybody out there, but I might be an attorney. But for those of us that are non-attorneys and confused by this, it seems like it's just another language, and we can't really understand what they're saying in these court decisions, in these GAO recommendations, in these Court of Federal Claims decisions. Well, I'm going to give you a little secret about how to read these court decisions on the next slide. It's called the IRAC method. Now, I know you're thinking of a country in the Middle East, but it's IRAC, and what that stands for is issue, rule, application, and conclusion. And most legal briefs, most legal memoranda, most legal decisions that you would be reading, including those about government contracts, they're going to follow this format. And this will kind of track the way the whole decision is written. The ones you care about the most would probably be the rule and then the application of the rule, because if you hone in on what rule is being discussed in that court decision, you're going to internalize that, and you're going to be able to apply that to your future situations, and that's going to be how you can get the most out of reading that court decision. I'll give you a little hint. When you read the GAO bid protest decisions, all you have to do to find the rule is look for the underlined words, because that means that they're citing to a previous bid protest decision at the GAO, and then the sentence preceding the underlined stuff. Well, that's your rule. You can take that one to the bank, folks. So if we move to the next slide, I want to just emphasize, and I want to repeat, and I want to ensure everybody gets that in government contracts, you don't want to do what Ronald Reagan said. He told us that we should trust but verify. No, in government contracts, we need to verify. We are dealing with a contractual relationship. Everything should be explicit. We should search for proper authority. What we should not rely upon is what I like to call Fred said. Oh, I thought somebody told me we can do it this way, or, oh, this is the way we've done it here for 7 years. Well, maybe you've been doing it wrong for 7 years. We're professionals. We're going to do the research. We're not going to rely on personal authority. We're not going to rely on received wisdom. Instead, we're going to use critical thinking. We're going to hone and exercise our research skills, and we're going to provide excellent analysis for ourselves, for our companies, for our clients, and for the government that we deal with. So again, the four sources of authority that you're going to want to look for: give me a statute, give me a regulation like the FAR or like Title 13 of the CFR for SBA, give me an agency policy, or give me a court decision. If not, you need to search harder and tie it to one of those four sources of authority. Now, I left out probably the most important source of authority, because everybody knows first you look at your contract, but I think that goes without saying. Now, where do I find these research resources on the internet? Well, you can look at acquisition.gov. That's the official online source for the FAR. It's maintained by GSA. Or there's an alternate, which is unofficial, maintained by the Air Force, called FARsite, F-A-R site. Another really good resource is wifcon.com, WIFCON.com. They have a great discussion page where there's all sorts of issues being asked and answered by professionals in the field. You can also go to gao.gov and you can request a daily digest of all the bid protests so you can start to absorb those patterns and those rules and those decisions that we've been discussing. You can also email me. I send out a monthly newsletter with a little nugget of information about government contracts. Of course, Jennifer Schaus also has a wonderful newsletter that I highly recommend that you sign up for as well. And then finally, law firm blogs are actually a really good source. You've got these very expensive, very talented attorneys giving you free information. So I would encourage you on particular topics, look up a law firm blog or article that's written about it. I've certainly learned a lot from those resources, and I encourage you to do the same. So Jennifer, that's all I have for my presentation. So I'm going to wrap up. If anybody has future questions, you can email me at christoph@christophllc.com, and I will hand it back over to Jennifer.
Super. Thanks so much, Christoph. Great presentation. And for anyone on the line, again, that has questions, you can reach Christoph directly at his phone number listed here or his email address. As I mentioned earlier, tomorrow we are covering FAR flow-down clauses. Next week, we get into some pricing with indirect rate, cost proposals, and GSA schedules. The full schedule of our webinar series can be found on our website under the webinar section. The recordings are all there below the schedule, and they are segmented by topic. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us today, and we hope to see you tomorrow.